All right, everybody, welcome to the Vibin Higher Podcast. As always, I am your host, Trevor, and today I sat down and spoke with author Liam Scheff. Now, I was introduced to Liam's work, namely the book Official Stories by our friend from Homegrown Health Radio, Joni Abbott. I picked up a copy of the book, started reading that. I started looking at some of Liam's other work, and I just knew that we had to have him on the show. Liam's a really interesting guy, a really fun interview, as you'll see, despite some of the topics that we talked about being sort of dark. One of the things that we got into in the beginning was stories that he broke 10 years ago, actually, about orphans in New York being tested on by pharmaceutical companies and the whitewash, the sort of cover-up that happened as a result of that. So we got into that. He sort of broke down his book, Official Stories, for us, which I highly, highly recommend. We'll get into it in the interview. But it was a really fun interview. Liam's a really great guy. So without further ado, our interview with author Liam Scheff. All right, Liam. Well, first of all, thanks for joining the show. We spoke briefly a little bit earlier, and I let you know that Joni had recommended you and recommended your book, which I have since begun to read, and I wholeheartedly recommend it to anybody out there listening. Official Stories, and we're actually coming up on the 10-year anniversary of a story that you broke. So hopefully we'll be able to get into that. But yeah, thanks for joining the show.
Thank you, Trevor.
And all right, so yeah, let's talk a little bit about that ICC investigation. So this was something that you broke in 2004 that had to do with a clinical trial scandal, correct?
Yeah, there's an orphanage in New York called Incarnation Children's Center where the crack addicts of the early, the mid-90s, when cocaine flooded American cities, probably helped into the country by CIA.
Yeah.
That people think that doesn't happen, but you can look it up and you can decide for yourself. I think the evidence is really strong that the drug trade and the clandestine services work overlapped. So for whatever reason, in the late 80s and certainly by the early 90s, a lot of cheap cocaine was heading into American cities, and it was finding its way into the urban centers, so Harlem, Washington Heights, and then in South Central, et cetera, in Los Angeles, Detroit, Philadelphia. And so mothers would take this, women would take this stuff and get pregnant and, give birth to damaged babies. And these babies were often left at churches or hospitals. And Incarnation Children's Center was a place that took the abandoned babies of crack addicts. And it existed there, and they took care of the kids, and some of them died, and they nursed some of them back to health. At a certain point in the 90s, the National Institutes of Health, and I think the AIDS machine, which is really what it is, it's kind of a religion, decided that this group of kids would be a perfect sample population to test drugs on. And they did, and they tested a lot of drugs, many drugs in combination at higher than normal doses. Children were given, that's one of the names of one of the studies, 7 or 8 drugs at higher than normal doses in children 4 to 22, which isn't really a child, it's a young person, but starting at 4. There were vaccine experiments, there were experiments with HIV-negative children and newborns. I didn't get to that point. These children were children of crack addicts, but eventually they were redesignated, I think, as HIV-positive children, because HIV testing came into vogue in the black community, at least in the medical infrastructure. They decided to test the black community somewhere in the early 90s, because they had burned through the gay community as sort of a market. They had given them a drug called AZT, and they had killed, or gay men had killed themselves, or the drug had killed them, however you choose to look at it. There's a movie called Dallas Buyers Club, which is the only, and they lie at the end and say that the drug actually helped people if they just lowered the dose, but in this point of the movie is the drug killed a lot of people. The drug was called AZT.
Okay.
So they had burned through this population of gay men with this very, very toxic drug that kills your liver and kills your bone marrow where you make blood, and kills the lining of your stomach, kills your intestine, kills the cells, literally kills them, and you die. And that happened to hundreds of thousands, at least many, 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 many tens of thousands of gay men. You can figure that out because the death rate from what they attributed to AIDS in about 86 was about 12,500. And then they dropped AZT in, which was a chemotherapy drug. And the death rate went up over 5-6 years to 50,000 per year. And they took AZT out, and the death rate went back down to what it was. So, the AIDS machine doesn't like to talk about that. But they needed a new population because they needed to get the drug approved for children, for the children of people that they said were, HIV positive. So they used this orphan population in New York, and they did trials there. And I got a hold of the story through really a series of activists, and I was writing at a paper in Boston, and I investigated it. The story was outrageous. You have to check to see if these things are true. So I was told the story by a mother, or an aunt, really, adopted mother of 2 kids who were in and out of that orphanage, being pulled in for not taking drugs. They were being pulled in for not taking the drugs that they were supposed to take, which happened to be these same drugs, these black box labeled drugs that have killed adults at normal prescribed doses. That's what a black box means. Mm-hmm. So they're being pulled in and out of this thing by the Administration for Children's Services, ACS, which acts as a kind of police for the pharma companies more than anything in New York. I suppose they actually look into abuse allegations, most of which, God knows, most of which are probably not true. They're probably just parents fighting and blackmailing each other. But what they really do is that they go after parents who aren't towing the pharmaceutical line, which is really the place that we live now. We live in a place where the pharmaceutical industry has become a religious state unto itself. And you can get into fights online and in person in person people tend to still be a little more human, but online you can get in monstrous fights, not even debates, about whether vaccination is safe, or you're a denier of science if you don't want to inject your children with something that came out of a test tube and was mixed with aluminum and squalene. You can be called a denier of science if you don't want to give yourself or your child a drug that is a black box label drug that's killed adults. That's where we live. So they did the trials. They were doing them. I went into the orphanage. They were indeed drugging the kids. There were many deaths that were reported to me. There were kids that I met. There was a kid that I picked up because I went into the orphanage undercover as a visitor. This was in 2003. Uh-huh. And I went in and picked up a kid, and the kid just about jumped into my arms, and he was a friend of the kid that I was that I was supposedly visiting. I was with the aunt, and we went in, and I played friend of the family, which is odd because I'm not really very African American looking.
Right.
But that's all right. I just, hey, what are you going to hold it against me? Who knows who our parents are?
Yeah, exactly right.
So I went in, and the kid, I met this one lovely kid, and then another, Ariel, and then there was another boy called Sion, and they both had this tube surgery. So the deal with pediatric AIDS is that if you don't take the drugs in your child, they will force you to take the drugs. And first they'll put a tube up your nose that goes all the way down your esophagus into your stomach, and then if you continue to refuse the drugs, they'll puncture your abdomen. They'll do a surgery. They'll put a plastic button in your gut, and they will just inject the drugs via a plastic tube and syringe. You can look that up online. It's called a PEG tube. People don't really want to believe that, but you can find, pediatric AIDS that they help the children take the drugs who aren't taking the drugs. And the reason that children don't take these things is because it makes them throw up violently and have violent diarrhea, feel sick, and not be able to function. So they're using their instincts by not taking them, and then they're, of course, forced to take them. That story was, very easy to prove in many ways. I mean, I did due diligence, but all I had to do was go to the NIH websites, clinicaltrials.gov, and look up pediatric clinical trials, Incarnation Children's Center, and there were about 36 studies. I mean, I guess it was hidden in plain sight. Who goes trolling around in NIH, clinicaltrials.gov? Who does that? Nobody, unless you're trying to figure out where to get a study located or who to make money. The studies were funded by Bristol Myers Squibb and Pfizer and Genentech and other giant pharmaceutical companies, as well as you and me, the NIH, that's tax money, National Institutes of Health. So the story broke, and then I was going to have it in a magazine, and they wanted me to rewrite it for magazine format, and it was going to take 10 months, and I told them that they were being lazy and cowardly, and I was going to put it out myself. Because, that was the prime time of the new media. You could just publish a story on a news accumulator or a news site, and if it was true, people would investigate it and it would get picked up. And I figured that was a better thing to do at that point, rather than waiting for 10 bloody months, while this was happening. So I felt a great pressure on me to do it. So the story came out, and immediately it was picked up by the New York Post and the UK Guardian, and it was true. You couldn't deny it. They were doing experiments on children, on orphans. Then there was a movie made, and this ACF-TV contacted me, and I worked with Milena Schwager, who was a good, researcher and director, and they made a documentary. I was just there for some of the research. They did what they did with it. I continued to write. I got 3 or so articles in the New York Press, and assisted with an article in Hustler, and was interviewed many places, and was on the radio in New York. And my sources got on the radio with me. Mona got on the radio. She's the aunt. That's an alias for her. But then Minerva Pasquale, who had worked at the thing, Mimi got on, she came forward. And I interviewed 6 or 7 people who worked at the place and got them on the record. Most of them used aliases, so I didn't quote them extensively, but, Mimi just came forward. I got to talk to a handful of kids, 5, something like that, and then I got to track the progress of others, and that was the story. Then the New York Times caught up to it, interviewed me for about an hour and 30 minutes over 2 interviews. I provided them with a ton of data, names. They contacted my sources, a nurse who used to work at the place, the mother of 2, the aunt of 2, and I gave them just a ton of data, and they came out with an article saying that everything was fine, that there was no evidence that any children were harmed, and that it was one of the great successes of the AIDS industry that this happened.
The fabled, everything is fine.
Yeah.
Don't look
Everything
here.
is under control,
Yeah.
Situation normal. So a week after they came out with their clearly, their red journalism, their cover-up article, in which they said, don't trust me because I was published on the internet. But, so were all the medical journals. They're published on the internet.
Yeah.
A week after that, I came out in the New York Press with, another article with people inside the orphanage explaining what was happening there. Which article do you think gets quoted in the Wikipedia? Right.
Yeah.
So 3 years later, the city of New York was the answer is not the one that's honest, not the one that tells the truth. 3 years later, the city of New York, after great pressure, there were town meetings over this. There were significant protests in Washington Heights about this because the community became aware that its children were being used in medical trials. So the city of New York paid $3 million to something called the Vera Institute, which came out with a report that said the drugs didn't hurt anybody, but 25 children died in the studies, 55 children died after the studies, and then on air, the guy who ran the thing, name escapes me right now, I should look it up, but the guy who ran the thing said that over 200 bloody children had died who had been involved with the trials. Jeez. So what's the truth? So the Wikipedia says that no children were harmed. Now, what did the Vera Institute get to look at? They didn't get to interview a single child. That's right, I did, but they didn't. And they also were not allowed to look at what? A single piece of a medical record. They didn't get to look at the medical records. In other words, they didn't do anything.
That would seem to me, from the outside, to be the 2 things that they should probably want to do, right?
Talk to the children, see the medical records, you'll figure it out. The children would tell you that the drugs made them puke and have constant diarrhea and want to die. And that many children died or some children had strokes after starting the drugs, some children went blind after starting the drugs, some children had not been on the drugs their whole lives, went on the drugs, were healthy, went on the drugs and died within a month or 2 or weeks. children who refused the drugs, whether it was for the trials or not, whether if they refused the drugs, they had their stomachs punctured and they had a peg tube inserted, and then the nurses would take the dry drugs in a mortar and pestle and shove them in with in water in a syringe. This is the AIDS industry.
Well, it seems to me to be a pretty clear whitewash, right? The
Right.
investigation that apparently New York had done.
So that's in chapter 6 of my book Official Stories. That's one chapter. It's one story of 10 stories that is just not. It's an official story, and official stories are there to protect the institutions, official stories exist to protect officials.
Mm-hmm.
And that little syllogism came to me after doing this work and looking at not just the AIDS stuff, but the vaccine stuff I'd begun to look at that point, and other sciences like Big Bang theory. First there was nothing, which exploded. This is the central beam of our modern science. First there was nothing, and then there was everything. I mean, as a philosophical construct, it really begs many questions. You have to ask yourself, who invented these theories? Who invented the idea that giving people drugs that would kill them would also save them? That's cancer therapy. Drugs that will kill you will also save you. Really? Won't they just kill you slowly? I mean, maybe they'll kill some cells, but they'll also kill you. And that's the problem with cut, poison, burn cancer therapy. And that's my friend Ty Bollinger. His book, Cancer Step Outside the Box, is one I wholeheartedly recommend for people researching cancer, because it's a huge series of cover-ups.
Is he releasing a new series sometime soon?
Whenever this is on, it would be the week of May, I want to say 26. But yeah, he's got an online free week-long seminars, interviews, real documentaries with people who are movers and shakers in the cancer industry. Ty is just so brave, to constantly stand up against an industry and be slagged. He'd say the same about me, but I don't constantly fight this industry. I don't think you can. I like what he does because he's pointing to the positive, and that's what you have to do in the end. I can tell you that the AIDS industry it's essentially a religious construct. Like most of the sciences of today, it lives in a place in a different century that worries about people's sex lives. It's the medieval church, it's the Catholic Church telling you to be terrified of sex if you're black or if you're gay. For the white heterosexuals of the world, not so much. Don't worry so much. Don't get tested. Certainly don't get tested. That would throw off the test results. They're very clear about that. HIV tests are really the fraudulent center of the Oreo cookie of the AIDS industry.
Uh-huh.
HIV tests are, they're not so good, are they? They're not so. How many things do they come up positive for? That's an interesting question. You can go search the internet for that answer. How many things make HIV tests come up positive? And then if it's more than one, or if it's more than maybe 6 dozen, you might begin to wonder what use they have at all. And then you might wonder who gets an HIV test. And you might realize that if you're a white heterosexual going to UC Berkeley or SDSU, San Diego State University, great party school, rumored to be, or any of the junior colleges where, hookups and relationships are regular and rather fluid, you realize that unless you're in that black community or that gay community, you're not being targeted for HIV testing. Now, if you're a white middle-class girl, you're targeted for HPV vaccines. That's new. Didn't used to be, but now you are. Because, HPV is the thing that the white middle-class girls have to worry about, and the black girls too. But really, the black men and women and all the gay men have to get HIV tested. Why? Well, doesn't it? It seems to meet a number of criteria that don't have anything to do with laboratory science, but really work on the old principles of people that we just think are not godly or are lesser than in the medieval mind. So in the mind of the medieval or late medieval or even Renaissance, Africa was a very far away place, and in the age of exploration and in the colonial age, Africans were there to be subjugated. They were ungodly and unchristian, and homosexuals were always ungodly and unchristian in the medieval mind. Now, to my mind, none of that is true, and to worry about people's sexual orientations is as meaningless as worrying about whether they like vanilla or chocolate ice cream. I just don't care. It's irrelevant. But the culture is fascinated by people's sexual orientation. And it's created a ghettoized class of gay men who had nowhere to go, could not inherit property, could not get married, and therefore had to move to these inner city ghettos where they would move into old apartment blocks and maybe rehabilitate some of them and gentrify. But they were young gay men living alone, living away from family, living away from a calming influence. And because they were men, and men run on testosterone when we're in our teens and 20s and even early 30s, and because they had nobody to slow them down, they had no reason to slow down, and they had a lot of sex. And when you have a lot of sex with a lot of different people in very confined quarters, in clubs, in bars, at the docks, at the piers, you get a lot of STDs, real STDs, the kind that show up where you pee. Yeah. That's how you know you have one, because it burns and hurts and you have pus discharge. That's an STD. The STD that we're now supposed to worry about, you don't know you have. The doctor has to tell you that you have it. You'll never know that you have it, probably because you don't. But the doctor you have to go to the doctor and you have to take a test. And maybe the test comes up positive for 6 dozen things, but they're not going to tell you that. They're just going to ask you if you think you're at risk, meaning are you black, gay, or a drug user? And if you are, they're going to take that test and they're going to say, we think this test, even though it comes up positive for 6 dozen things, we think this test for you is pretty good. Now it's time to take the drugs that we've already talked about. And guess what happens?
Well,
I'll take a pause. I will take a pause. Your audience is reeling.
Yeah, no. Well, I was going to say that I think that it comes back to a word that you mentioned multiple times, is that industry, right? I mean, am I wrong in thinking that a lot of this goes back to perhaps making a profit and diagnosing things that potentially maybe don't need to be diagnosed, so that they can get customers essentially on these pills or treatments, whatever they may be, for the rest of their lives?
Profit is a good motive. It's not the only motive, but it's a very good one. And AIDS researchers make tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars to do their research, which, for something that they say is a science, really acts like a religion. You're not allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to ask questions about it. You're not allowed to ask about any component about it, or you're a denier of science. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a religious point of view. I mean, I can criticize any TV show I want without it being a denier of television. I can say the writing on Mad Men was bad, or the writing in The Wire was bad in season 2 and great in season 3, 4, and 5. It doesn't make me a denier of HBO.
Well, I think you had mentioned, again, several times that there's this sort of nowadays there seems to be almost this sort of worship of science, and we talked briefly about atheism as well. And it's not a hard thing to bring up in a conversation with somebody who's trying to use modern science to sort of squash things that you bring up. That it wasn't that long ago that modern science, as it were, said that the Earth was flat, or said that the Earth was the center of the universe, or one of however many things there are out there that were just absolutely false.
Well, I don't think anybody really ever believed the Earth was flat. There was a notion that the Earth was the center of the universe, geocentrism, and not the sun, heliocentrism. And science will claim that it was a victory for it, in Galileo and Giordano Bruno. And I guess it was. The problem with science is that science just means an interpretation of data. Scientists used to be called natural philosophers. And this is in my book, again, Official Stories. I open with this conversation. But scientists used to be called natural philosophers. Very nice thing to be. Go look at a butterfly's wings. Wonder about the colors in it. How did it come about in such form? It has such clear patterning. What is the mind of the universe that creates this sort of thing? How does it work is a mechanical question. Science has transferred all of its weight from the how is it patterned, and what is the mind of the universe that could create such a thing, whatever that mind is to you, to, what is the mechanical function, and can we interrupt the mechanical function artificially, and can we replicate it and then change it and put it in a pill? It's a reductionism rather than a holism. We're not interested in the organic nature of the thing anymore, nor the mind of the universe that had to be present. I'm not talking about Yahweh or a particular God or deity. I'm just saying the mind of the organizing principle of the universe is clearly there. If we ignore this, we ignore everything to our own peril. There is an organizing principle. We defy it all the time. We break the skin, we inject stuff from monkey ovaries, dog kidneys, testicles, hamster ovaries. We inject the stuff that we grow in there, we call that vaccines, into small human bodies. We break the skin. Nothing in the history, in the 200 or so thousand year history of the human species, ever prepared us for this kind of what my friend Robert Scott Bell calls an onslaught. We're not built to have our skin punctured and to have weird stuff from other animal cells mixed with metal, aluminum, adjuvants like squalene, mercury. We're not built. We have no excretory system at this level. We're not built.
All right, we lost Liam's Skype connection for a second here, but he's going to pick back up with the Big Bang Theory.
What is the universe a big stupid accident? Well, this is the crowning achievement of modern science. First there was nothing, and then it exploded. This is a myth called Big Bang Theory. This is in chapter 9 of my book, Official Stories. Trevor, who invented Big Bang Theory? We heard about this in school. First there was nothing which exploded, and then everything happened. We don't know why. Who invented Big Bang Theory? This should be very well known to us.
Right.
I know who invented the telephone. I know who invented radio, Marconi and Fermi and Alexander Graham Bell and Watson. But who invented Big Bang Theory?
I mean, I really couldn't tell you.
Yeah, because they don't want us to know. It was a guy. His name was Georges Lemaitre, and he had a hobby. He had a job long before he started dabbling in mathematics. He was an abbé in the Belgian Roman Catholic Church. He was a priest, a Roman Catholic priest.
Wow.
He was very clear that so-called Big Bang Theory, what he called the cosmic egg, was his attempt to reconcile biblical Genesis. First there was nothing. First there was darkness on the face of the deep, and the Lord Yahweh very specifically said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And the math that was coming, out of looking through telescopes. He was very clear that he wanted to marry the two stories, and he did. And that's what we have as the center of science today. A story from Genesis, from a very particular culture, at a very particular time. It's just another creation story, as is Big Bang Theory, which isn't a theory. And it's been disproven, and people cling to it. And it's such a lousy theory that people have had to invent sub-theories to bolster it. So instead of being able to look in outer space and see what's there, which is electrified plasma, instead of looking out there and seeing it's an electrical universe, that everything interacts at the level of the electron, the electrical nature, the electromagnetic force, which creates the pinwheel shape that we see in galaxies and whirlpools and hurricanes and tornadoes, and the lightning shape that we see in lightning and tree roots and our venous system in our bodies, the veins in our body, and the layering that we see in our own cells and in the cells of nebulae. When you look out into pictures of nebulae, they look like cells and they look like hourglasses.
Yeah, that type of stuff is incredible. And
that's all plasma. That's the electromagnetic force. It's not a big dumb mystery. It's electromagnetic force. Now we can't see the beginning and end of time. So we don't. The first there was nothing which exploded is a story that is as real as The Hobbit, or probably less. Because The Hobbit, in many people's minds, is true for some reason. I don't know why. Not a very good movie. So we live, and this is what my book is about. Official stories exist to protect officials. I wrote the book, Counter-Arguments for a Culture in Need. I wrote the book that was a corrective textbook to all the tall tales, and they call them that instead of lies, that I was taught growing up in school. I wrote the book that I wanted to receive when I was 18 and 22 and 25 and 30 and 35 that said, look, American history is not George Washington and the cherry tree and Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves. American history is business and Smedley Butler and War is a Racket and the CIA. That's American history. It is JFK being assassinated, making a right turn on Houston when that car should not have gone under those open windows and it should not have veered from the parade route. It is 9/11. It is buildings going away at free fall speed because we're running a little bit low on that thing that makes modern society work, called oil, and we have to have a foothold in the Middle East. It is the vaccine state, the AIDS religion. It is the story of Shakespeare, another lie that we're taught in school, that a guy, Will Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, who had 2 illiterate parents, 2 illiterate daughters, and an illiterate granddaughter, a guy who didn't own, get this, any of the plays of Shakespeare when he died, didn't leave them to anybody in his will, didn't own a book, didn't own a manuscript, didn't own an encyclopedia or a dictionary, left nothing to anybody except some property, his second best bed, but nothing literary. This guy didn't write these works. This story is important because we have guys like Julian Assange and Snowden, whatever his name is, Edward?
Yeah, Edward Snowden.
And Rupert Sheldrake being attacked by the scientific community for coming out and criticizing the scientific community. And Andy Wakefield, making a rather conservative criticism of the vaccine industry, being ridiculed and slammed and libeled and slandered. So you would wonder, why would somebody, when you have a queen like Queen Elizabeth I, who killed people for disagreeing with her, for fighting her, had people locked up for their entire lives, who had, in the Elizabethan court, a nest of vipers, why wouldn't you just come out and say whatever you wanted to? Well, I think I just gave you the answer, because you would be killed.
Yeah.
So maybe a group of people, and that's chapter 7 of my book, and we get into the Shakespeare argument. And then the evolution argument, that life is an accident that changes by accident, that's Darwinism. It's bloody patently ridiculous. And nobody in really advanced evolutionary sciences now plays with Darwinism anymore. They're all in something called epigenetics, where they realize the environment is as important as the creature itself, that the environment changes the organism, not the organism accidentally changes, and then that happens to make a newt into a duck-billed platypus or something. But they're still not there. Anyway, that's chapter 8. Chapter 9 is the Big Bang stuff. Chapter 10 is plate tectonics, which is a funny story I was taught in school, which states that the Earth is growing, but it's also shrinking at exactly the same rate of speed, so the Earth really doesn't grow at all. That's a fable.
Yeah, I mean, we all learn plate tectonics in school, but to hear it like that, it almost sounds a little bit ridiculous.
And it was invented in the 60s, and it's not true. I mean, it's not. They'll argue for it. You can argue for anything. So my book is called Official Stories, Counter-Arguments for a Culture in Need. I'm providing, I think, very reasonable counter-arguments to 9 or 10 of the big planks of what we grew up thinking was true.
Well, I wanted to give a little sort of microcosm example of maybe what you might be trying to do with the book. I was in the Marine Corps, and you mentioned Smedley Butler, and just to give an idea of sort of the creativeness, I guess, and for lack of better words, maybe information controllers. As Marines, we all learn about Smedley Butler, and he was one of the most decorated Marines in the history of the United States, and all of this stuff, and there's buildings named after him, and there's roads named after him, and everybody knows Smedley Butler. But it wasn't until well after I had gotten out of the military that I learned about another thing that you talked about, which is his book, War is a Racket, which is a really revealing thing, and something that obviously they probably don't want you reading. So you'll get bits and pieces of information, and you'll learn to sort of worship this guy Smedley Butler without realizing the gravity of what I consider to be the most important pieces of his work, like War is a Racket.
Yeah, Smedley Butler came out and acknowledged that while he was the youngest, most decorated, youngest to be the most decorated Marine in history at that point, all of the things they were doing, going into going into Central America, going over to Asia, China for the Boxer Rebellion, the Philippines, Dominican Republic. All of these things, he said, were for the purpose of Standard Oil or Dole Bananas, United Fruit Company, I should say, which became Dole. Or, in other words, the oil companies, the textile, the manufacturers, whatever American business wanted to be in another country, send the Marines. That's what the early 20th century was about. He wrote about it. He wrote a book called War is a Racket. It's widely quoted. But I didn't learn about him in school. I bet you learned about him in military college.
Well, I learned about him in the military, but nothing about any of what we just talked about. It wasn't until after the military, through my own research, that I learned about this entire other body of work that he had done that they of course don't teach you about while you're in the military.
Right.
And
that,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well,
I
go ahead.
was just going to say that it was actually this weekend I liked on Facebook. I've got a Facebook because I maintain a Facebook for the website here, and I liked on my own personal Facebook Veterans for Peace. And within a few minutes, I get a message from one of my buddies who was he was in the Marine Corps with me, and he had a hard time, I would say, and probably what a lot of people think of when they think of the wars that we've had recently and what people might go through. And he said, what is this Veterans for Peace? And I immediately knew, like, all right, great, So I just tried to keep it short, and I said, it's just this organization of veterans that are for ending the wars. And he messaged me back and said, okay, man, like, LOL. And I was trying to think, is there a way that I can attack this and sort of, like, let him know that it's not that I'm attacking the military? And it was almost sort of perplexing to try and have to deal with that it's not by any means attacking the people in the military, but it really is being on their side, right? But there's this, I don't know, there's just this weird dynamic of this idea that has been fostered over the last 10, 15 years that if you don't support what's happening and the troops, then you're not a good American. Or if you don't support the wars, then you're not a good American. And especially if you're a troop, so to speak, if you don't support the wars, then you're not being a good soldier or a good Marine.
Sure, it's an old thought form. I'm sure you can find some of it in, I want to say Thucydides, but if that's wrong, you can find it in the Peloponnesian Wars. It's very easy, as it's credited to, I think, Joseph Goebbels, but it's very easy to drive a people to war. First tell them they're being attacked, then tell anybody who's criticizing you that they're, for the enemy, and essentially get them in trouble or get them locked up.
Right.
And fan the flames. We're a tribal species. And I think that if people think that they can change all this, I'm going to tell you that you can't. You could be aware of it, but we're a tribal species, and we always have a king that we give power to, and we always have a priest or a group of priests that we allow to answer the questions of existence, the big questions. Why are we here? How did we get here? Where do we go after we die? What's the meaning? Why do we get sick, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't have a king, or we do, or we say we don't, but you know that we do. We have an aristocracy, and we worship them. From the Kardashians to the Obamas, we just worship the aristocracy. We make fun of them, but we worship them. Mm-hmm. We worship them with money. And we have the priest class, which is now the scientific establishment, like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who can make something called the inexplicable universe, I think was his recent PBS, something like that. The incomprehensible universe was his recent PBS thing. Well, it's not incomprehensible, you moron. It's that your model is wrong. Big Bang, sorry to call but Big Bang Theory is wrong. And if they go from that model, they're stuck with gravity at the center of everything rather than the electromagnetic force. And gravity is a very weak force. And because gravity is so weak, they've had to invent space monsters like black holes and dark matter. These things don't exist. This might surprise some of you to hear this. There is no such thing as a black hole. There's no such thing as dark matter. They invented this to hold up a theory or a hypothesis that didn't work, which was that first there was nothing which exploded. And because they had to work from a broken model, they had to continue to invent things to make the model work. Well, if you make the Earth the center of the solar system, and you say that everything spins around it, and you plot Mars, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Pluto, whatever, Neptune, all these, and the Sun too. If you say that all of these things spin around the Earth, you can make a working model in which, from our earthly perspective, all the things rotate around the Earth. You have to then put other cycles called epicycles, so that Mars might go in an ellipse or a semicircle at some point, but it also has to make little curlicues now and then so that it doesn't lose pace or it doesn't go too fast. And the same with the Sun. If your model is wrong, if your theory is wrong, if your central idea is wrong, it doesn't matter how many good observations you make. You won't be able to fit them anywhere if you only fit them into that model. Let's say that I was foolish enough to don't hold this the wrong way. I just foolish enough to get married and believe in the conventional argument about marriage. So let's say that I do that, and my wife, say that I married a woman because I'm not in California. So I married a woman, and she is gaining weight, and I notice that, and she can't figure out why she's gaining weight, and I'm very sympathetic. And I'm saying, I'm so sorry. And I notice that the cookies that we buy are also disappearing. But she tells me she's not eating the cookies, and I just choose to believe her. I then have to reason that raccoons are breaking into our house at night, picking the lock, eating the cookies, rolling the bag back up, locking the door, and leaving.
Yeah.
This is what I have to do. Instead of just saying, are you eating these cookies? I think you're eating these cookies at night. I think maybe we should just not eat the cookies. Well, let's not buy the cookies anymore. Let's just both become vegans for a while and go on a raw food diet. We'll both lose weight. But if my model is wrong and I refuse to acknowledge that somebody is eating the cookies and that's why the cookies are going away, and it is not invisible raccoons who come in and disturb nothing but the cookies and then roll up the bag again, if I say that outer space is all ruled by a very weak force called gravity, very weak force that you can break by lifting yourself or any object off the surface of the Earth, the entire thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of square miles, you can pick up a glass. The whole Earth is pulling on this, and you just defy the Earth. And if you could build a stepladder or a stairway that was 7-8 miles high, you could walk out of the atmosphere of the Earth. Gravity could not hold on to you.
You're making me feel a lot better about my day-to-day life.
Well, there you are. Gravity's a weak force. The electromagnetic force, not so weak. Try to pull a molecule apart. You're going to have a very hard time. The electromagnetic force is reasoned to be 1,000, not 1,000 times stronger than gravity, 1,000 trillion times stronger. That's 10 with 39. That's 10 to the 39th power, 1 with 39 zeros.
Wow.
That's much stronger than gravity. So outer space is not machined by gravity, but because they have a bad model, because first there was nothing which exploded and they only relate it to gravity and not the electromagnetic force, they have to say, well, there must be giant invisible pockets of gravity that we don't see, and 99.9% of the universe must be invisible pockets of gravity. We'll call it dark matter.
Well, I've got to ask, because you and I are having this conversation. These conversations are being had all over the place.
By the way, that's in chapter 9 of my book. If you want the details, just do me. Look, it's $12.50 on Amazon. You'll like it. It won't hurt you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to say, I've bought books recently. That sort of seemed like they came out of a printer at somebody's house. Like there's not a very good quality to a lot of the stuff that's coming out nowadays, and it's a good paperback. It is only $12.50, and it came to my house in a couple days. So I did order off of Amazon as well.
Thank you, Amazon and the printer, and yes, it's a nice company, and they do a nice job. And I like the color of the paper. It's a kind of beige. I don't like staring at white. Black and white hurts my eyes, so I chose the natural colored paper. And it's fun and easy to read. But I think more than that, or along with that, it's 10 topics in 11 chapters.
Well, that's one of the things that I wanted to get into, is that I struggle very hard with one of the topics that we like to talk about a lot here at the website is this idea of a global awakening. And I struggle a lot with finding one good documentary or one good book that covers so many things, or it covers it in such a way that I can give that to somebody, and that can be sort of their, the light bulb that goes on in their head that will send them down all these different types of or paths of research.
Was it the blue pill?
Yeah, exactly. That's a perfect metaphor. That and your book does that, and it in a sea of different. I've got a whole library sitting right in front of me, and I've got plenty of excellent books that cover one topic. But your book, Official Stories, really does do a good job of covering a lot of things and doing it in such a way that is digestible for the average person who may not be very comfortable with things like this.
Well, right. So I hate 900-page books about one thing. If you can't say what you're going to say in a chapter, I don't really understand. I mean, I understand that stories take time to tell, but we're just talking about, these are arguments. I can make an argument for you in a paragraph. I can make a really good argument for you in a page. I can make a perfectly well-detailed argument for you in 20 to 30 pages of a paperback book.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. I think the AIDS chapter is 40 pages, the 9/11 chapter is 40 pages, everything else is about 30. The whole book is about 200 and something, 200 pages, 210 I think, on Amazon. And it's a nice sized, relatively thin book that it's not too skinny, and it's not, and you don't have to lug it around, and it's comfortable. And I wanted it to be all of those things. I remember the first go around with the printer, I made a mistake in font and paragraph break, and the book was like 300 something pages, and 300 something pages is pretty thick. It's a very different experience, and I thought, this is not what I want. I don't want people to be cowed by the size of the book. This is a friendly book. So I recalibrated and realized that I had put too many breaks between paragraphs, and so I was very happy with what it came out as. But it's also it's also not lightweight. You're not going to feel cheated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say. I've recently, over the past couple of years, have gotten books, and I grew up. My grandma's an author, so I've always just had this love for books. I love the smell of books. I'm sort of sad to see the way of the iPad sort of coming around and all of these bookstores closing, but you don't feel cheated. It is obviously, the topics covered are incredible. You do it in an incredible way. It's well put together, and I
make a lot of jokes too. I just want people to know it's a funny book.
Yeah. I really would. I would suggest. This is something that I would give to somebody that was not well acquainted with a lot of these topics, and it's not something that's going to make me feel crazy giving it to them. Because there are some things out there that might do that. There's a movie that I like to suggest to people that, while it does do a good job of talking about all these wonderful things like alternative cancer treatments and the financial system and all this other stuff, one of the first things it talks about is like extraterrestrials and crop circles and all this stuff that people immediately write it off.
Was it The Hobbit?
No, you know what? I am a big J.R.R. Tolkien fan, though, so The Hobbit is still real to me.
The Hobbit is still real. Yeah, you see? We're a myth-making species. I don't think that this can be emphasized enough. If there's any center to my work, it's that don't think that some age of reason has taken away what we are. We're a myth-making, storytelling monkey or ape. We try to live without myths. Look at the liberal intellectual swath of America that thinks it believes in science. Look at these young boys. What are they all into? They spend billions, literally billions of dollars worshiping Roman and Greek gods dressed up in spandex. The Avengers, Thor, Spider-Man, Batman is Mars, the god of war. Spider-Man is what they would call a Typhon, a half human, half animal spirit. We're a myth-making species. We can't help it. If you spend $1 billion on something as a culture, it's not entertainment. It's a religion. That a Batman movie makes $1 billion means that people are going there to worship some aspect of the archetypical nature of life.
Yeah.
That's what religion is. That's it. We're going to find our myths today that are all gummed up with the military-industrial complex. Iron Man, Batman, that's all military-industrial. Avengers, that's all clandestine services. So, instead of just worshiping gods who go to war and make love and betray each other and use human beings for various purposes, We now worship people in the clandestine services who are military-industrial contractors. Or we worship genetic cloning and engineering in the form of Spider-Man. Spider-Man was originally, born in, I think, the 50s or early 60s, probably late 50s, early 60s. It came out of the Atoms for Peace, the atomic bomb problem that we live in for the rest of our lives. That people were actually splitting the atom and creating all these radioactive decay particles. So, it entered the mythic mind of humanity and said, well, what if you had a God, we'll call it that was made by science and that involved this radioactive thing? Well, how many superheroes, went crazy because of radiation experiments? You can track them all to the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. Now everything's genetic, because that's the current belief system. So everything that happens for genetic reasons. Well, that's not true either, But reality is in many ways unfathomable. But one of the realities that we don't like to think about, why we want to inject people against disease, well, vaccination never stopped a plague. There was never any great plague that was stopped by people going, well, we have to inject you. And if you say polio, you have to look up polio and realize that we were spraying, as a culture, DDT on children. And at what was called the height of the polio era, the scientific community decided to ignore all the pesticides that had gone into people's foods that clearly caused paralysis, and to spray a new pesticide, a neurotoxic agent called DDT, on children to prevent them from getting bitten by flies. Guess what went up? Paralytic polio. Chapter 5 of the book. Well, anyway, we worship a variety of gods, and I think the success of the Middle Earth series in film relates to the problem of us not really having the frankly, human beings are frankly polytheistic. Whether you believe that monotheism is true because there's one God that makes all things, or you don't believe in a God at all, or you believe that God has no name and cannot be named, or whatever you believe, human beings tend to be polytheistic. In other words, we worship many things, and we give many things power in our minds. The gods of light, we separate natural phenomena, right? And then you name it a god. So lightning becomes a god, and the ocean becomes a god, and the river becomes a goddess, and the moon becomes a god or a goddess, and the sun becomes a god or a goddess. You see what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I did want to ask you one more time, and then we can go ahead and wrap it up here. I talked about that idea of a global awakening. You sort of talked about the new media there in the beginning. Do you think that we're sort of on an upswing here? I mean, do you think that we're at a point in human history where a lot of the things that you talk about in the book and that we've talked about here are going to become common knowledge, and that we're sort of there is going to be this global awakening that happens, and we're going to be able to move past a lot of the issues that we have as a species?
No, not as a species. As a species, we live on planet Earth, and we've created nuclear death zones all over the planet. We're going to create many, many more. And, we'll toddle along as a species. Some areas will become slowly uninhabitable. And there's no we as a species. There are pockets of humanity. So if you, in your little pocket of humanity where you live, want to start advocating for hemp growth and permaculture and cannabis growth to remediate the soil, to replace the disgusting and debilitating pharmaceutical industry, I'm right there with you. But we as a species don't awaken. This is all, all tribes have these notions that we as a species awaken. That's in the Bible, and it's in the Old Testament. It's in the Babylonian stuff. Oh, when the darkness comes to us all, or when the light comes to us all. Well, light doesn't come to all people at the same moment. That's not the nature of the world. And darkness doesn't come to all people at the same moment. And some people's darkness is other people's light. So I don't really worry about that, I guess. That's not my purview. I think the best thing to do is to live where you are. So you get out and find permaculture is something I'm into. It's a kind of more permanent kind of gardening where you use the local crops, and you bury wood to absorb water, and you use all the kinds of things that make soil good, and you don't use pesticides and petroleum products, and you make more food you rehabilitate, you plant trees and help the environment along. If you want to do that, I'm right there with you. But, Trevor, this is a weird world. We're a strange species, and we're not going to fix all the problems that we've made because most of them came about either by our very nature, which we can't change as a species. We're a myth-making species. We can't change that. There's nothing to change it to. We can't really absorb facts without making stories about them. And as soon as we make a story about it, we're in danger of losing the fact.
Mm-hmm.
And facts change. It's the first thing I note in my book. I grew up in a family of doctors and scientists. They change their minds all the time. Therefore, facts change. So what are we talking about? I don't worry about global awakenings, I guess. We're here. We go to the other place, whatever it is, when we pass out of here, and life's a mystery. If you like Sex in the City, I would suggest enjoying it while you're here. If you enjoy going out and gardening, I would suggest enjoying that when you're here. If you enjoy long bike rides or holding hands with somebody you like, or if you're polyamorous and think that's the best thing in the world, I would enjoy that where you're here. If you're sure monogamy is the best thing for everybody, I would enjoy that while you're here. I think that we have to enjoy ourselves while we're here. I like learning stuff. On the other hand, don't wait for tomorrow to start the stuff that you really want to start, because
exactly.
we just get this moment. We just get this moment. We just get this life as far as we remember.
And I think probably one of the worst feelings that you might be able to feel as a human would be to look back on whatever time you had and have a feeling of regret, I guess.
We always regret the things that we don't do for the most part more than the things that we do, and we regret acts of violence. I think we always regret acts of violence, so physical, emotional, etc. But that excluded, if you learn not to do any of that kind of stuff, and you learn to be a compassionate person and listen to people, I think we end up regretting the dreams that we don't pursue much more than the little mistakes that we make while we pursue them. So there you go.
Perfect. All right, Liam. Well, I wanted to obviously give you a minute here to plug anything that you wanted to the website. Obviously, we've said that the book, Official Stories, is available on Amazon. It's only $12.50. Highly recommended from us here at Vibin Higher. If there's anywhere else where people can get the book, just give you a minute to sort of plug anything that you want to get out there.
They can get it on CreateSpace. Our electronic friends can get it on Kindle. It's under $8. It's $7 and change. But if you buy the paperback, you can get a Kindle version for $2.
Oh, wow.
That's
okay.
not bad. Yeah.
Perfect. So is there a website or anything? I know that you don't have a Twitter, correct?
I don't yet. Soon I'll be doing a new show with a co-host, and we'll just have to give in to that, and I don't, I won't do it, but my co-host will.
It's not a bad thing.
And I killed my Facebook page and replaced it with just a page that you can like or dislike. It was too much after 3 years. I think I wasted, the number of hours you log into Facebook, it's just all these phantasms. Like none of it's quite real. And this discussion you were having with your friend, it's not quite real. I wouldn't even answer. I'd be like, hey, have a good day.
Yeah, right. I do say that Twitter is good for, it obviously depends on the sort of people that you surround yourself with on there, but it is an incredible tool for news and getting the word out there, I guess. But
I agree, and we'll do that. No, I don't have that. Just you can look up Official Stories on Amazon.com, and I am on Facebook, and I do post a lot of stuff on my Facebook page, which is Liam Scheff, so you can find that there.
Perfect. All right, Liam. Well, again, thank you very much for being on the show. It was an incredible time for me, and I thought we got a lot of good information out there. So hopefully we'll be able to talk to you sometime in the future.
Thank you, Trevor.
All right, folks, there you have it. That was an information-packed podcast, so I hope you guys all enjoyed it. I really cannot say enough good things about Liam, his work, especially the Official Stories book, though I do think that we're going to have to agree to disagree on the whole global awakening thing. I see it, I feel it, I know that we're in the throes of it right now, so I guess we'll just have to see what happens. I definitely suggest that you guys get out there and support him. There will be links for Amazon and his book wherever the podcast is available, as well as his Facebook. So definitely go and check those two things out. I know I've said it multiple times, but I highly, highly recommend the book Official Stories. So definitely check it out. As well, we're available on Twitter. It's at Vibin Higher. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/Vibin Higher. We're on Google+. We're on YouTube. You might be listening to this on YouTube. We're on iTunes. We're on Stitcher. And if you haven't yet, check out the website. It's vibinhigher.com. Go to the blog. There's tons of good stuff there. Lots of good articles. Our friend Jeffrey Jackson is a contributing writer. He knocks them out of the park every time he writes. A lot of amazing stuff on there from him, as well as some of my writing and just some cool stuff, some cool news, as well as all of the old episodes of the podcast. So get on there, check it out, give us some feedback, and again, let us know if there's anybody that you guys want to hear from. We're constantly looking for new interviews, and anybody that you guys think might be interesting or that you would just be interested in hearing from, let us know. We will definitely seek it out. So thank you for listening. We appreciate the support. We'll catch you next time on the Vibin Higher Podcast.